Schiller Institute was founded in 1984 by Helga LaRouche, who is Lyndon LaRouche's wife and his best student so far in the science of economy and statecraft. And the idea of the Schiller Institute was to strengthen the bonds of friendship and cooperation and culture between the United States and Western Europe at a time when that was severely threatened. And also to revive the ideas, some of the most noble, precious ideas of civilization that were threatened with destruction at that time. And I must say are threatened now. Because as Allie made it clear, we got a choice. I mean, we could really screw this up really badly if we don't implement the kind of great projects perspective, create a new system of cooperation among nations and peoples, to make this land bridge and Eurasian development and all that happen. That doesn't happen, then there's no bottom to the misery that the human race is going to endure. So what does that have to do with Schiller? Well, Schiller's known as the poet of freedom and Germany's greatest poet. There was a statue built to him in the 1830s, which was the first statue of a German that was ever constructed who wasn't a prince or a king or a general. A poet. Now, how many statues of American poets do you see around here?
One behind
Yeah, well, they don't build statues of poets anymore. They make movies and then screw up the traffic. That's what they were doing down there 2 weeks ago. All right. Now, the real thing about Schiller, I'll just tell you autobiographically. The reason I joined this movement is because I read an article by Helga LaRouche about Schiller, where she described how Schiller's mission in life was to create geniuses. That seemed like a good thing to do. Seemed like a good thing to be. I mean, remember what she was saying? What do we need? What do we need? Blah, blah, blah. Well, we need lots of geniuses. In other words, people who can create new ideas, who can create new technology, create new ideas about how to, new ideas in science, a new breakthrough, new discovery, or a new principle to operate in application of industry, or a new principle of statecraft, or a new a great piece of work, great piece of art. And hopefully by the end of my presentation and our discussion, you'll know why it's all the same thing. So the way Helga described it in her article was that Schiller's mission was to create geniuses. So first of all, to get cracking here, what was his medium? Well, Schiller was a dramatist. He wrote plays. He wrote poetry. He was a historian and a philosopher. Frank, are you ready? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm going to start off with a poem by Schiller. It's called Die Teilung der Erde, and Frank's going to help us out with that. I should mention that all this talk about Zeus, etc., sort of a lead up to this poem. Nehmt hin die Welt, spricht Zeus und sein Horn den Menschen zu. Nehmt, sie soll eure sein, euch schenke ich sie zum Erb und ewigen Lehen, doch teilt euch bürgerlich darein. Da eilt, was Hände hat, sich einzurichten, es regte sich geschäftig, jung und alt. Der Ackermann griff nach des Feldes Früchte, der Junker birschte durch den Wald. Der Kaufmann nimmt, was seine Speicher fassen, der Abt wählt sich der edlen Firnewein, Der König sperrt die Brücken und die Straßen und sprach, der Zehnte ist mein. Ganz spät, nachdem die Teilung längst geschehen, naht der Poet. Er kam aus weiter Fern. Ach, da war überall nichts mehr zu sehen. Und alles hatte seinen Herrn. Weh mir, so soll ich denn allein von allen vergessen sein? Ich, dein getreuester Sohn? So ließ er laut der Klagerbuch erschallen und warf sich hin vor Jovis Thron. Wenn du im Land der Träume dich verweilet, versetzt der Gott, so hadere nicht mit mir. Wo warst du denn, als man die Welt geteilt? Ich war, sprach der Poet, bei dir. Mein Auge hing an deinen Angesichter und deines Himmels Harmonie mein Ohr. Verzeih dem Geiste, dem von deinem Lichte berauscht das Irdische verlor. Was tun? spricht Zeus. Die Welt ist weggegeben. Der Herbst, die Jagd, der Markt ist nicht mehr mein. Willst du in meinem Himmel mit mir leben? So oft du kommst, er soll dir offen sein.
Take thence the world, called Zeus from his high summits to all mankind. Take that which yours should be. As heritage eternal to you I grant it. Divide it ye, yet brotherly. Then did all hands to preparation scurry. Both young and old industrious became. The farmer seized the produce from the country. The junker through the woods stalked game. The merchant in his stores had riches hoarded. The abbot chose the noble vintage wine. The king had all the roads and bridges boarded and claimed, the tithe of all is mine. Quite late, just as the vision was accomplished, the poet neared. He came from far away. Ah, nothing more remains to be distinguished. A lord o'er everything hath sway. Ah, woe is me! For why should I then solely forgotten be? I, thy most faithful son. Thus did he make his accusation loudly, and threw himself fore Job's high throne. If thou to dwell in dreamland have decided, replied the god, then quarrel not with me. Where wert thou then, when I the world divided? I was, the poet said, by thee. Mine eyes did hang with thy expression, upon they heaven's harmony my ear. Forgive the spirit which by thy reflection enwrapped did lose the earthly sphere. What can be done? Said Zeus. For all is given. The crops, the hunt, the marts are no more free. Wouldst thou abide with me within my heaven? Whene'er thou comest, 'twill open be to thee.
Everybody get what's happening in that? You don't get what's going on? Okay, the title is Division of the World. Okay? And Zeus, representing, the god, right? He says, you can all take parts of the world, right? But be brotherly about how you divide it. And that's when all the people were scurrying, remember? To see what part of the world they were going to control, right? The hunter, he gets the hunt. And the king, he puts up toll bridges on all the he puts up a toll on all the bridges and all the roads and collects it because he's the government, right? And he basically gets 10% a cut of everything, right? The abbot, in the monastery, he's got the wine. He gets the wine commission. The merchant. Well, no, the farmer. He gets the farm goods. Okay. So these are all the wonderful things on the earth that get divided. I mean, there's probably miners involved, who dig up stuff from the ground, and fishermen. You get the idea. You couldn't go through the whole list, right? Okay. So then what happens? The poet shows up, and there's nothing left. Everybody's got something, but he's got nothing. Are you with me so far? Okay. So he says, "Oh, wait a minute! I don't get anything, and I'm your most faithful son," he says. Right? And then Zeus says, "Well, what are you talking about? You weren't here, so you missed out. Where were you? You gonna blame me?" And he says, "No, I was busy contemplating your beauty and greatness. So I kind of lost track of where I was and lost track of time, so I missed it." And then, Zeus he's a little bit stunned, and he reflects on this, and he says, "Okay, well, there's nothing left on earth for you, but if you would like to come live with me in heaven, anytime you want to come, the door is open." Does that give you a better idea?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear. I hope you got some of the music in there, or the actual poetry. That's why I started with the German. Now, why would I start with this? So God is inviting him up to heaven to dwell with him when he wants, when he can do it. Now, how is that a gift as compared to the farmer or the hunter or the fisherman or whoever? I mean, some people would say that's kind of a jip.
Well, they're restricted to their mortality. They're restricted to what they have right in front of them. In a sense. Yeah.
Well, let's think about it. I mean, what do poets usually end up with?
No.
A lot of them end up with nothing. That's right. I mean, especially English poets. Okay. I was thinking about this. English poets, good English poets, what do they end up dead real young. The good ones. The whole time they're alive, they're getting attacked by the oligarchy. All right. I mean, you think about Edgar Allan Poe. You think about Schiller. By the time he was my age, he was dead. Okay. So why be a poet? Well, do you see a benefit of dwelling in heaven with God? Or a God? What would be the benefit of that? No?
It's probably pretty cool.
All right, well, let's get to the issue here. What's poetry about? I mean, is he talking about something? Is this actually what happened? Is he telling a historical story?
No.
So what is he doing? What's the point of this poem? I'm not saying I got the final answer, but
Create an
I
idea
want you to think about it. Yeah, what idea is he creating here?
to demonstrate the quality of poetry.
That the poet determines kind of what happens in society to a certain extent, I think.
It's not in that poem.
I don't know if
God,
it's
you
in
go to
that
live with
poem.
God, if God is the one that's doing
It's a matter
everything
of
else and kind of
like-
Well, you do have a
top down.
point. You have a point. If you're right up there with God, you might have a certain amount of influence.
Well, I think because why? I mean, he was obviously offering the poet something that he knew the poet would would like. Like he didn't offer him something else that he may have could have offered him.
Mm-hmm.
He said specifically, "All right, you can take this." So he must have had an idea of what the poet sees as his own desires.
But I thought he was giving to people what they produce. What they created.
Well, I like what Ed said. I mean, is the fisherman going to appreciate being able to visit heaven, and he comes back and the earth and he's got nothing?
He wants fish.
I mean, the fisherman could appreciate it if he were a poet, right? If he had that kind of a disposition, yeah, and also was a fisherman, right? I mean, we know that not all fishermen, that's not their only thing, I mean, There was a guy named Jesus. He was a fisherman. You know, he had other things going for him. And a carpenter. And a fisherman. You know. But I'm not going to get too much into that. But all right, there's an idea here represented here. Now, I think interesting what Ardina said, because what goes on in heaven? What does it mean to be a god? Now let's not get into monotheism, polytheism. But what is a god? A god is supposed to be powerful, right? As opposed to earthly mortal, right? Right, and he's also supposed to be immortal. Right. Now, for most people, the deal is you don't get to go to heaven and join God until after your physical body perishes, right? That's the deal, right? But the poet, he's got an open door invitation anytime he wants. I know. All right. Now let's get a little bit. Let's get off of the Greek Olympic. Those gods were kind of jerks. Let's get off of that conception of God to a higher conception in terms of power that governs what goes on in the universe. Because that's what I would want to get at. Because I mean, there's a lot more power there than there is in, you know, throwing lightning bolts or, you know, chaining people you don't like to mountains so that eagles can eat their liver. That's the kind of, you know, bush league stuff that Zeus would do. Right. The real power is what Prometheus did, right? To show man how to use fire. Now think about that. Think about that kind of power. Think about the relationship of the poet to that. Because what is the source of our power, really? What is the power of a fisherman? His rod. What you say is a long enough rod, he doesn't need a Porsche? No. He could get the fish on the net, right? No, come on.
On the net.
Get to feed people.
The fisherman knows how to catch fish, right? The farmer knows how to grow food. The abbot in his monastery, he knows how to produce the wine or the champagne or the brandy. But what's the common thing? They know. They have some kind of knowledge. They have some kind of skill. Right? Now, where does that come from? Where does knowledge come from?
The mind.
That's the idea. Ideas. And that's the realm, that is the realm where the poet lives. In the realm of the idea. And that's where the power over nature comes from as well. So that's quite something to be able to elevate yourself so that you can go hang out with God. It's quite powerful, isn't it? Now, I mean, Schiller has lots of poems, obviously. That's just one of them. That's not the deepest one. But I thought it was a good place to start. Because as Helga said, the guy wants to create geniuses. Now, in terms of a genius, again, it's somebody that creates new ideas, breakthroughs, that changes the way mankind can control nature, can improves his power over nature. All right. So the question is, well, how do you create them? Now, obviously, you teach them, right? You educate people. Mostly, what we think of as education is, well, you go to school and you read things in books, or you know, somebody gives a talk and then you take a test, or you write an essay or something like that. And it's on the level of ideas or like some kind of like it's almost like the same as, you know, learning a skill. Does that sound about right? Or or what? And that's what you do. It's kind of put it this way. It's kind of a neutral idea in the sense that you learn a skill, like a mathematical skill, or you learn some facts about what's happened in the past, in your history class. Right? Maybe you go to a shop class and learn how to do carpentry or metalworking or something. Now, in terms of creating a genius, what are you talking about? You're talking about you have to impart knowledge, but the characteristic has to be the transformation of the knowledge. How do you create a new idea? So we're in the realm of ideas here. Now, if you look at the history of the human race, that's the key to everything, is the ability of at least some people to create new ideas that increase mankind's power over nature, and the ability of other people to assimilate those ideas and incorporate it into their practice. Right? Now, LaRouche has proven rigorously that that's not only a good thing that people do, but it's the essence of economics, and it's the only thing that maintains the human race, as opposed to us, living like baboons. Without technological progress that is generated by an individual making a discovery, and the assimilation of that discovery by other people, the human race doesn't survive. Now, he's proven that rigorously, and that everything that he's done in economics and politics, etc., flows from that. So it's a very important question. How do you create people that have that capacity? Now, Schiller, he knows that, and he actually, well, I'll give you a little bit of history. He was born in 1759. His father was a military doctor, and this was a time when Germany was ruled by dozens of these little governments. If you could imagine that if you lived in Quincy, and the guy in charge of Quincy had the power of life and death over his subjects. If you go a few miles over into Cambridge, there was another king or a duke or whatever the hell who had the power of life and death over his subjects. Can you imagine? That's kind of a crazy setup. That's how it was in Germany. And in his case, he lived in Württemberg, and the Duke of Württemberg was named Karl Eugen. And since Schiller was of a certain class and was fairly good student, he was picked out at the young age of, I think, 13, to go to the Karlsschule, which was run by Karl Eugen, which was a military academy, but not a nice one. Okay, imagine a military academy run by a guy who has the power of life and death over you and your family. What's that like? They weren't completely arbitrary. It's not like, he could just, summarily execute you, but, they could lock you up on bogus charges and throw you in jail, and you pretty much had to do what this guy said. All right, now Schiller learned he had to go through a struggle of mastering knowledge in the school. The most important thing was his fight over his soul, because what they were teaching at this school was empiricism and sophistry. He was fortunate that he had a teacher who was always challenging the students to develop the rigor of their conceptions. The teacher's name was Friedrich Abel. So he had to work through the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, for example. You ever heard of anybody else that did that when they were 13, 14? Yes, you get a gold star. This is philosophy, right? This is, the life and death investigation of the nature of ideas. And this is what he was doing. He was being trained to be a medical doctor. That we actually, in our last book, the Schiller Institute, we translated a bunch of these Schiller's poems and essays and dramas into English. And then the last one we published, there's some essays that he wrote when he was a medical student. Very interesting. But so how does a guy who's like impressed into military service, his father's a military doctor, he's forced to go to this academy for, from the age of 13 to 20. How does he become the greatest poet of Germany? Any theories? Any guesses?
Zeus talked to him.
Talk to Zeus?
Did,
No idea, huh?
did he become a military strategist?
No, he didn't. He wrote a lot about that in his historical writings. Why does he become a poet?
Was he influenced by a poet? Was he reading like poetry and happened to like
Yeah, sure. One of his favorite poets was Shakespeare.
It seems like he would, I don't know, because you haven't given us that much, but you gave us this Kant thing. So maybe he, I don't know, maybe he had a rejection, some sort of response against Kant, some sort of reaction against Kant that caused him to try to develop something further. So he was pissed off by Kant. I don't know.
All right, well, I'll give you the easy answer. Decided to become a great poet because that's what he wanted to do. I know that sounds like a trick answer, but it's definitely true. And he actually said that his problem with Kant is that Kant had a pretty bad childhood. This guy must have been pretty miserable to write the kind of philosophy that he did. Because he basically said that the only reason people do good is because they would get punished for doing bad. That morality arises out of, I have my inclination to do what I want. It's going to do good for me, but society frowns upon that, so I have to obey society, even though what I'd like to do is whatever.
He says people doing good really are envious of those who don't feel the need not to do good, and they're jealous
Yeah.
and stuff. It's
Okay.
terrible.
And he's going to develop a whole philosophy of duty and morality based on that. And for somebody who actually grew up with a fairly happy childhood, that's kind of repugnant. So the guy he's rebelling against the idea that he has to be a slave, even though he's under compulsion to be at this academy. So he writes this play when he's like 19 or 20, called The Robbers. I'm not going to go through every one of his plays, but this play is like about these two brothers of this rich man, and one of them is very obedient, does everything that he's supposed to do, but he's a complete degenerate. He's completely evil. All he cares about is getting the inheritance. And he has another brother who, he hates the hypocrisy of society, so he basically drops out of society and becomes like a Robin Hood, running around with another group of students, and they, steal from the rich and give to the poor. Damn. And the funny thing is that they're the good guys, except it's not quite that easy. So he writes this play, right? He's in this military school. He writes this, and then these guys, and they start performing it, and all the guys in the school are going, "Yeah, right. You got to rebel against tyranny and against falseness and duplicity." So what happens? So the Duke says, "No, you better not do that anymore. You can't write any more plays." So he writes another one. He writes Kabbalah and Liebe. And supposedly it's a story about this noble guy. He's from the noble class, and he falls in love with this woman who's beautiful, but she's a commoner. And there's a whole lot of intrigues and Kabbalah and Liebe means intrigue and love. That's the name of the play. But in this play, he polemicizes against something that's going on in Germany at the time. Okay, he wrote this, I think, 1781. What's going on over the ocean? American Revolution. You ever hear of Hessians? Taking my water?
No, I'm giving you more.
Oh, great. All right, thank you. You've heard of Hessians, right? The Hessians were military conscripts, mercenaries supposedly, that fought with the British against the American Revolution. Right? Now, Schiller gives you the real story of what that was. Is that these oligarchs would round up these young boys, when they were just, turning 17, 18, round them up, line them up in formation, impress them in the army, and send them off to America to fight with the British. They were basically drafted to fight against the American Revolution. And he shows, there's one scene in there where he shows that one of these kids rebels against it and gets shot to death. So Schiller, he's polemicizing against this. Now, from that point on, let's see, not only does Carl Eugen ban his works, but he also has him arrested. But I'm not exactly clear how he got out of this. But he starts to realize that A, he can't stay in that area of Germany anymore. And B, it's pretty dangerous to be writing plays about what's going on that offends the oligarchy. You can think about Gauss if you want. So he doesn't give up on this idea that he's going to, fight against falsehood and fight in his work for the idea of human freedom, but he just does it in more remote historical terms. Okay, like for example, much later, like I guess 20 years later, he writes. This is probably if you've never heard of Schiller, you have heard of William Tell, right? The guy who's famous for shooting the apple off his son's head. Now that is a play. I mean, ostensibly the subject is these Swiss people revolting against the Habsburg emperor in the Middle Ages. But what it's really about is the American Revolution. And there's a scene where the people, the Swiss who are conspiring, see, they're in different units called cantons. They're not all unified, but they're sick of this oppressor. They've lived for hundreds of years completely independent. They didn't have, there had been emperors and kings, but they basically had their own separate government. But then this emperor comes in and is imposing his will on the Swiss, and they finally had it. So they have to organize a secret conspiracy. So they get together, I guess it was some camp in Pennsylvania or someplace. You might remember. You were there, weren't you? They get together in the dark and they set a campfire. No, actually, no, they're not. They're in Switzerland. But they get together and one of the leaders of the revolt, he gives this speech. I'm going to give you some of it. He says, "No, there is a limit to the tyrant's power. When the oppressed can find no justice, when the burden grows unbearable, he reaches with hopeful courage up into the heavens and seizes hither his eternal rights, which hang above, inalienable and indestructible as the stars themselves. The primal state of nature reappears, where man stands opposite his fellow man. As last resort, when not another means is of avail, the sword is given him. The highest of all goods we may defend from violence. We stand before our country. We stand before our wives, before our children." Then they all pick up their swords and they all say at once, "We stand before our wives, before our children." And they're organizing their revolt. Now, you heard, he talks about inalienable rights there. Where have you heard that before? Okay, so this is what Schiller is doing over in Europe. Now,
You said that was 1781?
well, no, that was published. I mean, that was first performed in 1804. That one.
Okay.
This is later, but I'm just trying to give you the sense that he doesn't write about what's going on at the time in Europe in his plays. But the guy's basically a fugitive for like, I don't know, 10 years. He finally gets set up in Jena and then in Weimar. And all of his work is focused on the subject of human freedom and creativity.
I mean, he's a fugitive between the time that he's trying to figure out how to not be arrested in Wurtemberg and...
Yeah, I don't know how long I don't know how long they had the warrant out for the guy. There's a lot going on. But you got to remember, it's like Germany's made up all these different little governments all over the damn place, and some of them are more open to progress than others. Fortunately, he ended up in a place where he could do his work without having to worry about getting locked up. I mean, there's a lot more I can say about these individual works, but I mean, look, you're not going to do that in a short presentation. What I would hope, though, is that going through some of this would inspire you to study this on your own, and maybe at some point you can get together and work through some of Schiller's ideas. You might actually think about the fact that a month after October 10th is November 10th, which is Schiller's birthday. You might want to do something about that. Have a party to celebrate Schiller's work. Just a thought. But let's get to the real meat of the issue. Schiller becomes this great creative genius, working to create other geniuses because he wants to. All right. Now, if you think back about Kepler, why does Kepler spend, 30 years trying to figure out how the planets move?
Because he wants to.
Yes, that's true. I mean, if you reflect on all the work that you've gone through just trying to read what he did, what he wrote. Okay? You're not going to get through that unless you really, really want to know what it is that makes these planets move.
That's true.
If you don't want to know, you ain't going to do the work. In fact, you could want to know and you still might not be able to do the work. But we'll do everything we can to remedy that. But that's what it takes to make a breakthrough. And in his case, he's overturning 1,000 years of superstition and sophistry, 1,000 years of axiomatic assumptions about how the universe works. Okay? Now, so that's an interesting thing, though. I mean, think back when you were a kid. Why did you go to school? How many of us went to school every day because we wanted to learn things and master knowledge and later become a scientist or a political revolutionary or, a doctor or something?
I mean, want to
Part of the time when you're little.
versus it actually happened.
Is that why you went to school every day?
I went to
Is
college.
that why you went to school, half the time?
Part of the time.
And what did you want to do the other time?
I didn't want to be at school the other time.
Let's face it. Is there anybody here that sometimes didn't want to go to school?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks. A little honesty. Okay. A lot of people, it's like a compulsion. Right? But later on, hopefully, you get to a certain age and you realize that this is good for you. And you actually enjoy it. Although, nowadays, I don't know if I can say that. There's things that go on in these schools now,
It's funny too.
probably
Bill,
not good for people to go.
'cause when you were young, you would want to do certain things, like become a doctor or astronaut or something, but you still wouldn't see school as that medium to do that. You just want to do this great thing. I know I always wanted
Right.
to be an astronaut, but I didn't know how school was going to help me do that.
Yeah.
Funny.
Space camp.
Yeah, I always wanted to go to space camp, and not to school.
Yeah, I would think that most people who really learn how to read because they want to learn how to read, not necessarily because they're going to school. Although, I mean, it's harder now because a lot of people that go to school and, well, when they come home, there's nobody there that's interested in reading anything. So that's the only place where they're exposed to the idea that you should read something. Right? Whereas a happier time is just part of the culture. You know, your parents read to you at night. You know, you see things that you're interested in. There's libraries, so you go and you read because you know that that's where you find out things. All right. Reason I'm bringing this up is because motivation, the desire, you know, the want to part of this is kind of important, right? And I mean, this comes up. I mean, it obviously when you're a kid, this is a big issue, right? Because when you're a child, well, what's a child like? Does a child act on the basis of reason?
Like George Bush.
A child wants to do what a child wants to do, right? Very often it's at variance with what you might call reason. That's not to say that because a kid is disobedient that makes them a bad kid. It depends on what they're being asked to obey. The point is, the child has motivations other than to, you know, show up and, you know, have perfect attendance and give the teacher an apple. You know, something else going on. But, I mean, this raises the question of, okay, well, if the human race needs geniuses, the human race needs people who will spend 20, 30, 40 years working on one problem to make a breakthrough. If the human race needs people, I don't know if I rigorously proved this, but you want to think about it. It needs people who are so dedicated to the idea of human freedom that they'll risk being jailed or banished or even executed to see it happen. And I would contend that the human race does depend on people like that. Then you have to create them. You have to do it just like if you know you're going to need a certain number of farmers. You know you're going to need doctors. You know you're going to need scientists. You know you're going to need people to do all kinds of work. Well, you need people that are going to create new ideas. And maybe not everyone is going to have the opportunity initially to spend all their time creating great ideas. But you have to have a population that can, once the great ideas have been generated, once the new breakthrough has been created, they'll be able to use it and master it. So that's what you need. So you need people who want to learn. You need people who want to make discoveries. You want people who want to, who will take the time and trouble to rework the discoveries that have been made before them. So you need people like that. But now let me ask you a question. In the kind of society that we're in now, is that what we're creating? I want you to think about it. I mean, you can make a kid go to school for 7 or 8 hours a day, right? But what happens after that?
There's some people who didn't come to the meeting who were going to a party.
No. How could that be?
I don't know, Bill. That's what I asked.
So they don't want to be here. Okay. That's all right. Whatever. I'll have to live with that. Well, I mean, just like you have to have a form of education that's going to teach people so that they can be farmers, or that they can be engineers, or that they can be scientists, or technicians, or lawyers, or whatever the hell you want. You have to have a way to train people to be geniuses. Now, are we doing that in our education system? All right, let's just leave the question of how you would organize a curriculum off to the side completely, okay? Because the real issue, and this gets to the subject of the main work that I was working on to prepare for tonight, which was Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. if you see a guy out on a sports field and he has a baseball and there's like a basket, about 30, 40 yards away, and he keeps throwing the ball into the basket, what do you think he's doing? More than likely. Practicing to be a pitcher in baseball, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's another guy with a bat trying to swing and hit the ball, right? They just do it over and over again, right? Because they're trying to prepare to be able to hit a baseball. Right, now that's a physical action, and it involves all kinds of coordination of the muscle and focusing of the mind, the eye, to aim it and everything. And it takes a lot of work to get really, really good at that, right? And you have to do it to the point where it's like automatic. Like, I'll give you another example. You ever hear of Larry Bird, basketball player? He was a real great basketball player. Made a lot of baskets, blah, blah, blah. Right? Why are you laughing? No cracking up about the Celtics. This is back when the Celtics were good. Okay? This big, tall, white guy made baskets all the time. Okay? A real freak of nature. Right? Just kidding. Okay. And he made a lot of money, right? And you know how they hire guys, sports guys, to do endorsements, right? So he was on a commercial, and it was supposed to be a funny commercial where he would be, shooting the baskets and missing. And they said that I heard that when they did this commercial, he had to shoot the ball 15 times before he could miss. Now think about that.
Not yet.
So what has been going on with him before that happened? How much do you have to work so that it takes you 15 tries to miss a basket?
A lot.
Yeah. It's like you're not thinking. You can't even make yourself miss a basket because it's so contrary to your nature. It's like in your soul that you have to make the basket. Why am I bringing this up? Okay. So if you see a guy, hundreds and hundreds of baskets, you know what he's doing. He's preparing to play basketball. And if a guy is, throwing a baseball, he's preparing for that. Another guy's swinging a bat. All right? Okay. Or, you see people out on the roads trying to drive, right? You ever see people trying to learn how to drive? Remember how it was when you had to learn how to drive? Okay. You keep working on it till, well, I know some of you need to learn how quickly. But look, the reason I'm bringing this up is because, okay, now what do a large chunk of kids do when they're not in school? What are they practicing to do?
Oh no.
Shoot other people in the head.
Yeah.
In most circles, it's frowned upon to take a pistol out and shoot people in public. Okay? But through the wonders of science and technology, and Bill Gates, and other supposed benefactors of humanity, it is now, for a very reasonable price, possible to have millions of children spend hours every day practicing homicide with a firearm. Okay, that's what they do. There was a whole lot of cases in the 80s, not the 80s, in the 90s, of young kids who had gotten so good at point and shoot video games that they were able to actually, when they emotionally cracked, were able to go out and commit mass murder, just like that. Then the guy in Virginia Tech, right? What he did. Now think about that. We have a culture where instead of having, if you saw a kid out with a violin, practicing with a violin, you say, oh, he's trying to make music. So what are these kids doing? Now, do you think that this is a neutral activity because they're not really going to go out? Because, millions of kids do it every day, but only a handful actually go out and shoot people. Okay, and again, this isn't, I'm just leaving aside the question of what goes on in the actual school. This is what goes on outside the school. This is what mom and dad pay for Christmas and for their birthday, so that they could do this. Now think about that, and now let's flip it over and think about something else, okay? You don't get really good at that kind of thing unless you practice and practice and practice, right? You're training your mind, you're training your, well actually you're turning off your mind, right? Because you're trying to get to the point where you can do it automatically without thinking, right? Just like Larry Bird can throw, just throw a ball at a basket and it goes in. And he almost has no control over it anymore, right? And that's what these kids are doing with the video games. Or you might remember in 2000 there was this case of these policemen. They saw an African guy walking into his apartment and they said, "Hey you," and he went and reached for his wallet and then they put 40 bullets in him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
41 bullets? I'm sorry.
Doesn't matter.
Now think about that. Okay, now in that case, what's going on? Training people to be killers. All right, now this is genius, right? You want to create a population that's, got all kinds of homicidal potential. That's what you would do. From a very young age, you train them how to be homicidal killers. Okay, now what does that bode for humanity? You can see it over in Iraq, You hear about this guy that got convicted of mass murder in Iraq? One of his buddies got shot and he flips out and they start killing people. That's what happened with this Blackwater security. They run a convoy and then there's some shots fired. And next thing you know, there's like 7 dead Iraqis who none of them had guns. Because these guys are, trained to commit homicide. All right? But, actually, there's a presentation that Helga LaRouche gave in 2000, right at the beginning of 2000, about this. It also puts it in a strategic context. If you think about it, we're actually now at the point where we're taking these people who've been trained in this homicide and we're shipping them overseas to, as imperial legions, like the Roman legions, to, implement these evil designs that Alec was talking about, that some of these oligarchs have. There's other stories, but you can fill in the relevant gaps. You probably know more about it than I, because you grew up in this culture. I'm a little bit more distant from it. Right? I never played. I only played Pong a couple of times. That's pretty harmless, right? Well, there's just one other thing I'm reminded of. Maybe you guys remember about 18 years ago, we invaded Panama. Remember that?
No.
Heard about it.
Yeah, I learned that later.
All right, do you remember the first Gulf War?
Yeah, the first Gulf War, 2nd grade. Yeah.
Okay. Do you know that they had these bomber pilots? They were playing heavy metal music, to get them psyched up to drop bombs on people.
Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And the thing about Panama was Noriega was trying to escape from this invasion. So he goes to the papal nuncio, sort of like the ambassador from the Vatican to Panama. So he hides out there, so there's diplomatic immunity, so they can't just storm in there. So what do? The U.S. Army sets up these giant speakers and they blast Ozzy Osbourne into this papal nuncio for days.
Oh my God.
Did you know that?
No.
Yeah.
Now, why did they do that? Now think about it. They use that, but actually you have thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions even people who take music like that every day and blast themselves with it voluntarily.
Were they using the torture prisons?
No, I was just going to say that. They actually use this music as a form of torture.
They use it to
some of the
torture
prisons that we
Iraqis,
have.
yeah.
Yeah.
But actually people do this on purpose. subject themselves to this one purpose. All right. Now, is that aesthetic education? Yes. You're actually,
aesthetic.
yeah. You're actually training people that it's good to be able to commit homicide without thinking. Right? It's good to be psyched up to drop a bomb. You know, one of the bombs they dropped in Baghdad killed like 5,000 people in a fallout shelter in 1991. Did you know that? Because it like exploded and sucked all the air out of the place, and it was like 5,000 people. It was like in a subway. There was a fallout shelter, sucked all the oxygen out, killed them. They don't tell stories about that. Everybody thinks that's a nice, clean war. You know, nobody got hurt. But that's the kind of thing. And the guy that did it was probably listening to, you know, Ozzy Osbourne or some other of this junk. AC/DC probably.
No.
No, probably not.
You sure?
Probably something a little worse than this.
All right.
Like Rob Zombie.
That's aesthetic education in reverse.
No, it's basically-
Okay?
Right here.
Me and,
In our culture in general, I'm glad you're laughing. But you got to think about this. This is a problem. This is a problem you got to overcome. Right? I mean, all right. Let's get to the positive area a little bit. Let me just ask you a question. Why did you join this movement?
So I wanted to figure out what LaRouche was saying about Jesus. Yeah, 'cause I couldn't figure out the paper why how Jesus Christ saved civilization. That's all.
You're interested in what Jesus actually did.
Well, I was interested in LaRouche's ideal on Jesus, because everything else that he was saying was sort of okay to me. And then when I got to that, I started to pull back a little bit. So I just, yeah. So I just looked.
All right. So, well, why did you actually decide that you were going to like do this all the time, as opposed to like read about it and come to meetings every once in a while?
I was excited about actually stopping all the bad stuff that I thought was going on, and LaRouche had a sense of it.
Well, there's something else, right?
I wanted to be a genius.
You wanted to be a genius. Okay.
And kick
Well, I'm
Cheney's
glad we
ass At
succeeded.
the same time.
You wanted to be a genius and do what?
And kick Cheney's ass at the same time.
And kick Cheney's ass.
That was at that particular moment. Still want to be a genius.
All right. Well, to do this, you saw what LaRouche was up to, right? Did you decide this before you met LaRouche or actually saw him in action?
I did.
Did they have an impression on you of some kind?
LaRouche?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to say anything about that issue?
What issue?
Or why they joined?
Oh, genius.
I'm trying to get to a certain point. I mean, I can tell you.
Well, when I realized that the idea of economics coming from LaRouche was that the creative mind, the human mind, had an impact on like the world. That just blew me away. I was like, man, because I had never thought about anything in that way before. And that the human being could actually like have a real transform things.
Well, here's the question: If you had met the so-called LaRouche organizers, and they were all a bunch of very serious, dour people telling you that civilization was about to collapse, and that only LaRouche has the answer, and you've got to do this, is that going to convince you? Isn't there something else about the person that's talking to you that has to be communicated besides like the facts, ma'am?
The what?
The facts.
I think it's a sense of like, for me at least, when I came in for the first time, I had never met an organizer before. I was run by just somebody who had been an organizer.
Right.
And I was just hit by the fact that there was so much that I didn't know, just this massive amount of stuff that I thought I knew but I didn't know. And they didn't communicate it. I mean, if you're told, Jesus Christ, you're just an idiot, like, are you going to start listening? Are you really going to keep listening? So it was just like kind of attention. But it's also sort of like this, like I have seen, it's just this spark you don't see in a lot of people. So.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I ran into, I was on campus, and I ran into Danny. And this guy is funny. Like, being in Detroit, it's kind of funny, because, like, your friends, it's probably the same thing everywhere, but our culture. But I was just trying to figure out, like, why is this guy, like, so dedicated to, like, coming to get me, like, 2 hours away from the office. I was always broke. He even brought me back. Like any time like I called or I just couldn't figure it out. You know, more things too.
Yeah.
That was and he's talking about, you know, agape.
Right.
You know. So it was really kind of dwelling on my conscience. Like, what's the difference between, you know, when you're in this social process or when you're in this environment as opposed to, you know, your friends from childhood, and you start making certain discoveries about what a friend actually might be. You know, trying to help you become more, you know, intellectually advanced or morally inquisitive.
Well, I tell you, for me, the more I found out about what the LaRouche movement was about and what they were doing, the more excited I got about the ideas, and the more I talked to my friends and teachers, etc., in college, the more freaked out and nasty they got toward me. And, you know, I got threatened to be expelled from the school for something I did. You know, organizing a meeting.
You were at Princeton?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
At a certain point, I made a decision. I'd rather be like those people than like these other people that I thought were my friends and teachers, etc. And I would submit to you that you made an aesthetic judgment at a certain point about the people in the movement, that you wanted to be like them, as opposed to, you know, well, they're nice people and I like what they're doing and I'll support it here and there. Or, you know, rejecting it. I mean, there's some people that are really offended by what we do. Right? Despite the fact that every single breakthrough in human history was made by an individual person, not that he didn't collaborate with others. You know, they get offended by the idea that one guy could figure out a solution to an economic problem. And they're even more offended by the idea that everything they see on television is lying to them about it. What? The nightly news? They're not lying. What? The internet? They,
It's all true on there.
yeah. They said X, Y, Z. I mean, despite all the crap that you heard from other people about what you were about to do, you made an aesthetic judgment. Didn't you? I guarantee you, if you didn't somehow, because look, I mean, I was a math major and everything, but I didn't like join LaRouche because, oh, so that's what Riemann meant. Oh, so you mean it's x cubed over z, not x to the second power over z. Right? It wasn't, it's not algebra. And it's not logic. I mean, are you really in a position to judge? You know, LaRouche gives a presentation about 2,500 years of human history and what you need to do about it. Can you, like, take it point by point? Or rather, have you ever seen a person at a conference do that? Mr. LaRouche, you said that, you know, in 1805 that the Venetians blah, blah, blah. You ever seen somebody do that? Those people usually go nowhere, right? It's like, you make a judgment. You say, damn, this guy, I mean, I've heard it from several people in different ways. That, oh, that guy rocks. Or, you know, he's right on the money. Or, oh, yeah, that LaRouche, he's the shit. But, I mean, it's crude. It's crude. Yes. But it's an aesthetical judgment. It's like you said, like, I want to be like that. I mean, did you ever have that impression when you heard LaRouche?
Mm-hmm.
I want to be like him. Or if you saw an organizer out having a fun, and you said, I want to be like him or her. Didn't that happen? If it didn't happen, let me know. I'm interested. All right. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Because it's not about knowledge, quote unquote. It's not about something you read in a book. At a certain point, it's a question of your emotion. What moves you? What is it? What do you want to do with your life? What do you want to do this minute? Right? Now, a lot of people think that that's some kind of realm of, well, don't go there, right? Isn't that the baby boomer thing? You can't tell me how I'm supposed to feel about something, right? Or people say, well, I have my opinion, you have your opinion, right? You say, oh yeah, well, if I let go of this book, it's going to fall. And they say, well, that's your opinion. Now, most of the time, it's not that blatant, but there's people who actually think that. And you run into them, but when it comes to people's emotions, they're all like that. You telling me there's something wrong with me because I don't agree with you? Or, I understand, you're right, we need a new monetary system, yep. We have a rotten culture, yep, we need Bush, Cheney, gotta get rid of them, but I'm not gonna do anything about that. I have other things to do. Yeah, you're right, probably civilizations are gonna collapse, but I can't do anything about it. And sometimes it's a little bit more colorful. But ultimately, it's like a complete shutdown of emotion, right? Or the opposite is like a overabundance of nonsense. But it's basically the same thing, There's different kinds of freak out. But it's an emotional thing, right? The reason I'm bringing this up is because Schiller said that, emotions are like the intellect. They have to be educated too. In this book, the Letters on Aesthetic Education, he says, well, hey, he's writing to this prince in Denmark, collaborator of his, and he's writing after the French Revolution. See, you got to realize what had happened, right? These conspirators working with Ben Franklin and company, they established a republic in the Americas. And the people who were responsible for this, they knew that they had to get away from oligarchism in Europe. How are you going to establish a republic where you walk 500 yards and there's another king or a duke with his own army, right? And you got to pay taxes, 5 times you go 5 miles, or some kind of nonsense, dukes and duchesses and that kind of crap. Every time I hear about the Queen of England, it's like, what the? Is this fairy tale land? Come on. This is the 21st century. Okay, but they knew you had to get away from that if you were going to establish a nation that existed for the benefit of the people that lived there. Because they tried it in Europe and it didn't work. They've had nice, benevolent monarchies and stuff, but that didn't cut it. Didn't do the job. Because King 1 is good doesn't mean his son is going to be anything but a bastard. Right? That doesn't guarantee anything. So they established a republic in the United States and in the Americas. So then there were other people who said, okay, well, now that we established in principle that it can happen, let's see it happening in Europe. And that's what people thought was going to come out of the French Revolution. Okay. Now, so what happened in the French Revolution instead of establishing a great republic? You had a reign of terror, and then you had this dictator, Napoleon. You had, government, lining up the great scientists of the age and cutting their heads off, like Lavoisier. Right? And you can imagine what Schiller thought of this, right? because this was a big opportunity, and it was completely blown. Instead of establishing a republic like in the Americas, you got this horrible reign of terror, and then you had this empire, the Napoleonic Empire. So he says, okay, well, we got to go back to the drawing board here. What are we going to do? Now he says to the guy he's writing to, I can't remember his name. Does anybody remember his name? Christoph something? This prince? You should look it up. I tried looking it up and I couldn't find it. He's saying, well, I'm going to write to you about aesthetics. I'm going to write to you about the subject of beauty. I'm going to write to you about aesthetic education. And he said, during the whole discussion, it's in the form of a letter or essays, but really it's a Socratic dialogue because he's constantly putting forth propositions to the guy, and well, he answers them himself, but he's trying to go through a dialogue process, asking questions. Why would I write to you, a prince, some guy who's got some significant influence in Europe, about art? Right, here we have the American Revolution, we have the French Revolution. It's been established that people can break the bonds of servitude to monarchs. So why am I talking to you about art? Did you have a question?
Oh no, you already brought it up.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
And he says, well, wait a minute now. The issue here, and then the first letter he talks about, well, he talks about the creation, the greatest work of art is the creation of true political freedom. How do you do that? How do you create freedom? And then he actually goes through a analysis of the history of mankind. I'm not going to go through the whole discussion, but he actually compares it in some ways to the development that goes on in an individual person, from birth to childhood to adulthood. And he says that the real problem, the big problem of government, or the big problem of how do you organize society that's worthy of mankind. Well, that's a big problem, because he says, well, first you have to look at the nature of mankind. That individual people, they have impulses, they have desires, they want things, they want to do things, they want to do what they want to do. On the other hand, you have reason. You have what science can tell you, rationality, what you can discover about how the universe is organized. And man has both these natures in him. An individual person, they have a physical side to them. They have to eat. They have sexual impulse. They want to be protected from cold and bad weather. They have these physical needs. These aren't met. They susceptible to disease. If these physical needs aren't satisfied, they aren't taken care of, then the physical, actual person dies. Now, how do you make sure that those things are taken care of? Is that a question of the impulse? Does a human being actually survive on the basis of following the same impulses as a baboon?
No.
You could have a society where everybody's acting like an animal, going after what they want, what they perceive as their desires, right? Scraping for food, fighting over mates, like baboons do, or other animals. But that's not human. Humans have a different capability to be able to figure out how the universe actually works. But that's a different quality than did you see in an animal. Because a human being can figure out principles, can figure out lawfulness to the universe. I mean, if you're an animal, it sort of just comes at you. And you have to deal with it. You know, everything is like a threat. You know? Even in a lot of times in some species, other members of the species are the biggest threat to you. All right? There's other animals, there's the weather, there's lack of food. I mean, if you're a predator, other creatures are your food. And if you're on the other side of that, well, hey, that's rough. Right? And humans, they're not organized that way. Okay, they have this capacity of reason. Okay, and the reason enables mankind to survive. But still, so here's the question: you got this physical nature that you cannot violate. If you don't feed the person and you don't take care of these other needs, they don't exist. Right? But what happens on the other end of things? You can be governed by whatever reason exists, whatever knowledge there is. But at some point, there's going to be a conflict between what this so-called reason dictates to you and what you want to do, what the individual impulse would drive an individual to do. Am I being clear what I'm saying here? Not clear?
No, you're being clear. At least it's unclear.
Is anybody unclear what I mean? Well, I'll give you a quote. This is from, remember I said Schiller, after he got away from this Carl Eugen, he goes to Jena. They set him up as professor of universal history. And he gives this great speech. And I actually read this, like it was a speech back in the other room, and it took about 40 minutes. And I said, well, maybe I should do my class in 40 minutes. If Schiller can do that, maybe I should strive for that. But I guess I've blown that, so. Schiller's talking about why should we study history? And how do we study history? Now this refers back to what he's talking about in the aesthetical letters. He's saying, he's talking about what people saw when they started investigating, going to America, Asia, Africa, etc. And he talks about what it teaches you about human history. The discoveries which our European mariners have made in distant oceans and on remote coastlines present us a spectacle as constructive as it is entertaining. They show us tribes which surround us at the most diverse levels of culture, like children of different ages gathered around an adult, reminding him by their example of what he used to be and where he started from. A wise hand seems to have preserved these raw tribes for us down into our times, where we would be advanced enough in our own culture to make fruitful application of this discovery upon ourselves, and to restore out of this mirror the forgotten picture of our species. But how shaming and sad is the picture these people give us of our childhood. And yet the level at which we see them is not even the first. Mankind began even more contemptuously. Those we study today we already find as nations, as political bodies. But mankind first had to elevate itself by an extraordinary effort to political society. Now, what do these travelers tell us about these savages? They found some without any knowledge of the most indispensable skills, without iron, without the plow, some even without the possession of fire. Some still wrestled with wild beasts for food and dwelling. Among many, language had scarcely been elevated from animal sounds to understandable signs. In some places, there was not even the simple bond of marriage, as yet no knowledge of property. And in others, the flaccid soul was not even able to retain an experience which repeats itself every day. One saw the savage carelessly relinquish the bed on which he slept, because it did not occur to him that he would sleep again tomorrow. War, however, was with them all, and the flesh of the vanquished enemy was not seldom the prize of victory. Among others, acquainted with the various leisures of life, who had already achieved a higher level of culture, slavery and despotism presented us a dreadful picture of them, Once we find a tyrant in Africa trading his subjects for a gulp of brandy. Another time they would be slaughtered on his grave to serve him in the underworld. Where once pious simplicity prostrates itself to a ridiculous fetish, another time it is to a terrible monster. Mankind portrays himself in his gods. Where over there we see denigrating slavery, stupidity, and superstition bow him down, yet another time we see him utterly miserable on the other extreme of lawless freedom. Always armed for attack and defense, startled by every noise, the savage strains his cautious ear into the desert. Everything new is the enemy, and woe to the stranger whom a storm hath cast upon the coast. No hospitable hearth will smoke for him, no sweet hospitality comfort him. But even where mankind has elevated itself from hostile solitude to community, from privation to luxury, from fear to joy, how bizarre and atrocious he seems to our eyes. His crude taste seeks joy in stupor, beauty in distortion, glory in exaggeration. Even his virtue awakens horror in us. And what he calls his bliss can only arouse our disgust and pity. So were we. And he's saying it took a tremendous amount of work to get from the level of people living like animals to having political organization. Like a tribe, right? Even though it's pretty crude and nasty, but even that's a political organization. They figured out if we work together, some of us can survive, but somebody has to be in charge. And if there's a dispute, well, this guy will kill whoever disputes him. I mean, think about kings and queens and stuff. I mean, that's pretty much how societies were organized for thousands of years. All right, now let's get back to Schiller and his happy childhood and his hatred of slavery. Okay. Now, what is the kind of condition that is adequate to mankind? I mean, I talked before about we have to make breakthroughs, we have to make discoveries in order to exist. I mean, I didn't go through the rigorous proof of that, but you do have to admit that we would be a lot more miserable if it hadn't been for all our discoveries, even if you haven't thought about it very much. I mean, the weather's nice now, but if we're having this discussion in 4 months, if it weren't for this nice office, we'd be pretty miserable. And the only thing that keeps us from living in this misery is scientific knowledge and application of it. Okay? So, but just like making scientific discoveries is necessary for the human race to live as humans, we have to do that in the realm of political organization. But here's the problem. Okay, if you're going to maintain the physical existence of the people in a community, then you have to obey the dictates of reason, at least to some degree, right?
Can you just say that again?
In order to maintain the physical existence of your society, you have to obey reason. In the sense that you have to be able to grow food, or hunt it down. You have to be able to protect people from the elements. You have to have some kind of defense against attackers from without. You have to have some kind of way to keep people healthy, right? That's what's necessary. And those things are not determined by how you feel, right? If you decide, well, I don't like the idea of sanitation. When I'm done eating, I'm going to throw whatever I've got left on the ground or on the floor. And I don't care about the consequences. Okay? Now, if you do that, what happens?
You get sick.
Yeah, yes, the biological realm will take over. You will have to be fighting for your food with vermin.
Or sometimes you get a president.
You will go sit down for a nap, and then you will find a mouse in your coffee cup. Once they figure that you're not going to do anything. Okay, I threw that little ad in there. Okay. The point is, the point is, this is what happens if you disobey reason, right? If you decide, well, I don't feel like putting that crop in the ground now. I know it's time to sow my crops, but I just don't feel like it. You know, I'd rather go chase women or, you know, hunt some baboons and play with them. What's going to happen is, if you do that, what happens at harvest time? If you do that, what happens at the harvest time? You starve, right? So you have to obey reason, right? So, I mean, that's why you have kings. Because you have somebody who's in charge that says, you got to do this, you got to do that. Okay? Now, that's to maintain physical existence, right? If you disobey, you end up dead. Either because you didn't do what you needed to survive, or the guy in charge kills you. Now, is this the kind of society that's worthy of human dignity? I'll put it this way. I mean, we're humans, right? We have all these wonderful capacities in us, right? Is that how we should be living? Well, obviously, if you don't obey reason, then you're not going to survive. On the other hand, is it a just kind of civilization for mankind that the individual has to do what he's told? That might be a hard question.
You're saying, can you?
Were you going to say something?
In a way, yes, because if they don't, humans are lazy, they're not going to do it themselves, so they kind of have to be told what to do. If you look at the population of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, some people are lazy. Some people only will do what reason dictates because the alternative is to get punished. But that's a problem, right? Because, I mean, that's not really freedom, is it?
Yeah, because you're saying, how do you get people to do things because they're reasonable? Not just because of the consequences of not doing something reasonable? Wasn't that what you were saying?
I'm trying to point out this paradox, right?
Okay.
The society as a whole has to obey reason in order to survive, at least to some degree. But is that adequate to mankind in the sense that let me back up a little bit. If you're going to have the capacity to make discoveries and do what's uniquely human, can you do that living as a slave? And I'm not mean you're just a slave to some guy with a plantation. If you're a slave to anything, if you don't have complete freedom, are you truly human?
We're all slaves, if you think about it. I work for a living, I pay taxes. That's a form of slavery to me, I don't know.
But you don't have to do that.
You don't have to, but at the same time, there's other ways to do it, so you're just validating those and saying that's okay.
All right,
if I was
so
selling heroin, would that be a good thing? I'm making money, I'm not being taxed.
Well, here's the thing. Yeah, if you're selling heroin, you're doing something that violates reason and also violates the law. All right? What if you're a hedge fund manager? You'd be getting lots of money for doing nothing beneficial to the human race, and it's completely legal. Now, to back up a bit, I understand what you're saying. You got to pay taxes. You'd rather not, right? You'd rather keep the money that you earn, right?
So many other things you can do with it.
Yeah, but why do you have to pay the tax?
I don't know.
All right. Well, what do they do with the tax?
I don't know.
You don't know.
What
What are they supposed to do with it?
Supposed to do good with it, but
They're supposed to use it for beneficial things, right?
I don't see much benefit coming out of it.
Well, yeah, okay, but I'm just saying, ideally, it's supposed to make sure that you can, drive to work without losing a tire, in a pothole, or that you can, you turn electricity on and there's something there, there's power, right? Or that, you turn the water on and garbage doesn't come out. These are part of the things that you pay for when you pay taxes, right? Now, of course, a lot of our money is being used to send people over to other countries and get killed. All right, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the ideal of the taxation. But you do feel the compulsion. And you feel this is a violation of your freedom.
Who's to say what I have to do with my money? I'm not saying that I'm not willing to do it, but when I see being free, I make my own choice.
Yeah.
I don't have to have
All
somebody.
right. Well, this is really the point I'm getting at, is that in some form or another, these governments violate your freedom because you'd rather spend your money on something else, right? But can you see what would happen if you didn't have that?
Chaos.
You have chaos, and that's what he was talking about. You know, about these savages, right?
I'm not saying I don't understand what you're saying,
Yeah.
but there's just different views.
Well, the point I'm making is this is an actual paradox in human history. Because
history repeats itself.
Yeah, because well, that's what we're trying to change, actually. In some ways, I guess. Because the question is, what is adequate to mankind, right? You have this power of reason. You have this power to make discoveries. You know, to create new ideas. Then you have to have freedom. You have to be able to exercise your powers in whatever way you see to do it. You even have to have the right and freedom to make mistakes. Right? But if there's no boundary to that, if there's no limit to that, and the limit would ideally be reason, as opposed to some arbitrary power by somebody else, then still that's not adequate to your human freedom. So in some form or another, that kind of society is inadequate. So he's saying, in the ideal, how could you create a society that doesn't violate that possibility?
How do you?
Hmm?
How do you?
Like, is it?
That's a good question.
Is that why you need to educate the emotions?
Well, here's the thing. Right? The only way that there's not going to be this conflict between what the individual wants and what the society requires, or what reason requires, is that his will, what he wants, would have to be in correspondence with reason. That would solve the problem, wouldn't it? You always have this conflict as long as there's somebody telling you what to do, right? There'll be a conflict between the ideal. This is assuming you have a state that's organized according to reason. That state is going to say you got to do this, you got to do that, you can't do this, right? The individual is going to want to do whatever it wants to do, right? So how do you resolve that dichotomy? The solution would be is if the impulse of the individual is in correspondence with reason. So, if the state is acting according to reason, if the society is organized according to reason, and the individual's impulses are in accord with reason, then you don't have a problem.
Can I just have your definition of reason? What's your definition of it? Just so.
Well, this is about acting on behalf of the way the universe is actually organized, as opposed to the way it's not organized. Which the way we usually think about it is in terms of science, right? What is true as opposed to what is false, right? Like, for example, it should be obvious to anyone that it's a bad thing to sell drugs like heroin, like you mentioned, to people. Because when they take them, it usually ends in destruction of the individual, right? By the same token. That's why it's illegal. And that's good that it's illegal. Okay. By the same token, it's not a good thing for someone to go into debt to pay a mortgage that they can't afford. Right? That's bad, right? But that's legal now. In fact, there's like legions of people who spend all day trying to get people to do just that. That should be illegal. Right? That's what we're trying to fix with this law, this HBPA Act. I mean, there's a lot of other things that really shouldn't happen. The question is, do you have to make a law to prevent these things from happening? Or rather, do you create a society where people know that they shouldn't do that? Do you see what I'm getting at here? That's a big challenge, obviously, which we haven't solved.
And saying that in this ideal nation we would not have laws.
Well, put it this way, they'd be kind of superfluous.
Because everybody would do it already.
People would know better. Oh, the question is not, do we wish it? The question is, what are we going to do about it? Because, I mean, maybe you can't get to that perfect state, but what are you moving toward? What is the ideal against which you measure the success or failure of a state?
But who's to measure success?
Yeah, how do you measure
the person that says this is successful? Like, everyone's going to have their own opinion. Like, I understand, like, I'm new here, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But the things you're saying, everyone has a different view of things. How are you going to infiltrate it into somebody to make them see the same reason? Does that make any sense at all?
Well, the point is, they have to have the capacity to discover that.
How do you do that?
And that's, and like, again, I mean, what if everybody acted according to the way the universe works as opposed to the way it doesn't work? Is there a problem? Let's think about anarchy. All right, what's the problem with anarchy?
The universe is not chaotic.
Anarchy means no government, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's in charge. No law. Do whatever you want. Now, how long does that last? That's about 3 seconds.
They have an anarchic state, I think, in Denmark, like an area where there's no government.
Mhm.
But what they do is they tap the electricity from the next state.
That's funny.
Yep.
That's funny.
It's like the-
I mean, one thing, like, I know I was having a discussion with you, like, I think 2 weeks ago about what is it to be free?
yeah.
And, like, one of the things that I walked away from that discussion with and thinking about is the idea that we're told we're free to be a human being, right? We're not told we're free to be a beast. So, I mean, the difference between what makes, it makes a difference between, mankind and animals, and beasts and mankind, and what exactly is that freedom, right? Like, because one of the things you said to me was, like, if your actions are dictated by simply emotion or instinct, then are you truly free, right? So that was one of the things I walked away from that discussion, and that's sort of what I think. And the other thing is just like one of the things Lynn said, at least from my understanding, what was the name of that paper? On Mauritius Discovery, was that the way that you judge whether something is successful or not is whether or not it allows for the, growth of mankind, whether or not mankind walks away from it better. And so that, I think, is sort of a measurement of whether or not something or a system is successful. Because if you have a system like we have now, where it's just how do we get as little people as possible, I mean, that's not the point of being a human being. I mean, if you look at just the Malthusian approach with global warming, which I just started really looking at, I mean, it's the real question of how do we cut the population, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one way to judge whether or not a policy or whether or not a society is successful.
Well, that's a question of setting a scientific standard. And when I say scientific, I mean not arbitrary. Because you were asking the question, well, how would you know? Well, the first thing is that you'd have to really want to know. You'd have to want to have a society that's governed by that as opposed to some kind of falsehood. Now, interestingly enough, our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, it states these principles, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, there's a lot, obviously, since Bush is president, there's lots of leeway. So we have to tighten it up a bit, okay? Right? Because it basically says you can choose who's going to be president, right? You vote so-and-so, blah, blah, electoral college, blah, 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 right? But is the country governed by reason when you can elect somebody like him twice? That's a problem. But how do you fix that problem? You can't fix the problem by saying, okay, well, Bush won the election, so now, oh, well, he's an idiot, so let's put somebody else in charge. That's kind of arbitrary. Or like, actually what happened is, Gore got the most votes, but we're going to put Bush in charge. As opposed to, these guys are both, this guy's a lunatic and this guy's an idiot. You better start over. Alright? That's not what happened in 2000. Found two guys so bad that nobody wanted to vote for either one of them. So it was like a tie. Like two worms trying to chew each other to death. Anyway, but seriously. I know it's funny, but it's true though. What's the standard to say that this is rational as opposed to something else? And when I say a scientific standard, you have to have a way of measuring. Just like, I mean, I don't know, if you work as a carpenter, you can't, just stick the nails in whichever direction you feel like it. Right? If you can't go to your car and say, well, let's see, today I'm going to use diesel. But that's not a diesel car. It takes unleaded gasoline. No, I'm going to do diesel. Al Gore said it was better for the environment. Things work a certain way and they don't work other ways. So you have to have, the only thing that really distinguishes us from animals is the ability to figure out what that is, and to organize things on the basis of that. But getting back to this other issue. Okay, so say we figured out scientifically how we should organize society. Now, and we want people to be free. We all agree people should be free?
Yes.
Who doesn't think people should be free? Who thinks people should just do what I tell them? All right. That doesn't work.
You have to run for president.
So people should be free. That means you should be able to do what you want to do. Is that true?
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Should you be able to do anything that you want to do?
No.
No.
Well, then who is to say what you can't do?
What you just said.
All right, let's see now. If there are certain things that you can't do because the law says you can't do them, but you still want to do them, are you free? Okay, now there's different things. There's things that you want to do that are good and right, and the law says you can't do them. Obviously, that's wrong, right? What if there's things that you want to do that are clearly wrong, and the government doesn't want you to do them, and you're forbidden? Or, look at this one. How about the things that you know are wrong, and you still want to do them? What's the worst? What's worse, not being able to do something you want to do, or being able to do something that you know you shouldn't do?
Or being able to do something you know you shouldn't do.
Are you free if you want to do something that you know you shouldn't?
No. Well, no. No.
If there's things that you can't do because somebody else or some force is preventing you, you're not free, are you? And what if there's things that you feel that you have to do that you know you shouldn't do? Same thing. It's like what he was talking about. This is a question. Are you free if your impulses force you to do things that either you shouldn't do or you know you shouldn't do them?
Why would they do that? Why would they do that?
Why would
The impulses. Oh, I guess you just.
impulses are impulses? Impulses are impulses, aren't they? Or if you think about Leibniz, he says that the monad, that seeks new perceptions, right? Or I mean, Schiller gets into it where he talks about how he gets more deeper into the question of what's going on with the human being, because obviously we have this physical nature that impels us to do things on the basis of physical instincts, right? And this is necessary for preservation of the individual and of the race. On the other hand, we have reason. And reason is what distinguishes us from animals. That's it. If we didn't have reason, we'd be animals. But we are animals. We're not just animals. Right? So, you see what I'm getting at here? Now, the animal nature overrides the rational nature. Is that good?
No.
It's obviously not good. Come on, people. That's bad. Wake up. Am I putting you to sleep? I'm sorry. All right. You're chewing over.
Can't tell when they're rhetorical or not.
Yeah, right.
But it's okay. Go ahead. You're doing good.
Well, sometimes sometimes there's a rhetorical answer to a rhetorical question. All right. So what if? All right. So. If it's bad if the animal impulses dominate over the rational impulse, right?
Yes.
Now, is it bad if the rational impulse dominates the animal impulse?
No.
It isn't?
What did you say?
If the rational.
Is it bad if the rational impulse dominates over the animal impulse?
What's the animal impulse you talking about?
Oh, see, let's get philosophical about it. Okay, let's go back to Plato. All right. When you create an idea of the universe, what are you doing?
There's a lot of things.
Okay.
You're probably using some of your experiences.
All right. Since you guys have been obsessing about Kepler for some reason, let's talk about him. What is he doing?
He's investigating what he sees.
All right. Planets are moving. Everybody agrees. They're moving. All right. And furthermore, Kepler says, well, there's to be a reason they're moving. And they move a certain way, and they don't move another certain way. The question is why, right? What's at the heart of the motion, right? And the planets don't. Well, let's start with one planet, right? Mars doesn't just do whatever, right? It may look that way, but he has to sort that out, right? There's the whole thing about the first motion, second motion, and all that, right? So then he has to figure out, well, what is governing the motion of this planet? Now, does he say, well, Mars is going to do certain things on Tuesday and other things on Thursday?
Different kind of law.
He's trying to say that every he's trying to figure out what is governing the action of the motion of this planet at every moment. Yeah? Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so I mean that's the first problem. He says there has to be a principle that's governing this, and he goes through all these things about eccentric circles and whatnot. That doesn't cut it. Finally gets to the thing about the ellipse, equal areas, equal times, blah blah blah. Right? That's a principle, right? Or at least that's the footprints of the principle that governs the motion of the one planet around the sun. That was a big deal, right? But there's a principle. There's a thing that comes before everything else. There's a one that generates the many of the observations, right? The observations are many. Yes?
Yeah.
The principle is
Few.
one. Thank you. Okay.
I was thinking.
Now, when it comes to the rest of the planets, all right, that's the harmony of the worlds, right? Now, what's going on with the rest of the planets? See, there's a principle operating that makes them move the way they do, right? He says all the planets are doing that, the same thing in their own orbit, right? Mm-hmm. Equal areas, equal times, the ellipse, sun is at the center. Well, what else?
Many planets.
Many planets, right? But there's something that's governing the way the planets move around the sun and their relationship to one another, right? Okay, you have many different planets, and they have many different actions, but there's one principle of the planet moving around the sun. And then there's the other principle of the relationship between the motion of the different planets relative to each other, right? And that's the musical harmony, right? Now again, that's a 1, 2, isn't it? That's a 1 as well, I'm sorry. It's a little more complicated 1. Okay, so you're taking thousands and hundreds of thousands of instants of motions that have gone on and repeated and changed and varied, blah, 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 over thousands of years. And you're identifying and demonstrating rigorously that it's all governed by one principle. Right? So here's the thing. That's what this impulse of reason is to do. So what is governing all the stuff that's happening? Okay? If you're an animal or a baby, what do you observe? It's just all this shit coming at you, There's things happening, things are changing. And it's constantly wild and it's scary. Right? Isn't it?
Guess so.
Have you ever walked into a room full of people, very angry, agitated, obviously passionate about something, and they're speaking a completely different language? You don't know what the hell's going on? You ever seen that?
Yeah, you can do it in an elevator nowadays.
Yeah, that should be scary to you because you don't know what's happening. Because they could be discussing what they're going to do to you. Right? Whereas if you know what they're saying, at least you got a fighting chance, right? I mean, if you hear somebody speaking a completely alien language to you, you don't know what's going on, right? Even though they could be communicating the most profound and passionate conceptions respecting man and nature. You don't know what the hell it is. They could be sentencing you to death or ordering a bologna sandwich, or reciting a great poem, and you don't know. Well, maybe not the poem. Okay? You don't know. All right? The whole thing about reason is you're taking the chaos of the senses and you're discovering the principles that govern that chaos. Because once you've done that, it's not chaos anymore because you know what's causing it. that make sense? Do you think that that fits with your idea of what a principle would be?
You said if you discover the principle of like what's causing chaos, even though you still may like see physically chaos, it's not chaos because you know like what's causing it.
It's not chaos if you know what's causing it. In other words, you can discover the ordering principle is generating what looked like chaos before, because you didn't know what was causing it. Or maybe it doesn't look like chaos. Maybe it looks like it's in order, but you don't know what the order is. Right? You may think the planets are moving in circles, because it kind of looks like that, but that's not really what's going on. You see what I'm saying? The impulse of a reason is to discover what is the one that governs the many. What's causing what's happening? What's the unseen, like in Plato's cave? What's making the shadows on the wall? Right? Now that's power unique to humans. All right, so now what's on the other side of the coin? What is the animal impulse? Think about it now.
A lot of it.
Don't assume that it's bad.
Yeah, don't assume. A lot of it is just like the basic necessities.
Yeah.
That because you have a body, it requires things like food and sleep and things that if your soul, if your reason's going to work, that vessel needs to be taken care of.
That's right. I mean, it's good that you feel cold and you want to get warm when you're cold, because if you don't, you're going to die, right? And if your body needs water, you get thirsty, so you seek refreshment. Look for water. If you didn't do that, you'd die. It's good. Right? And frankly, you think of all the hassle involved. If sexual activity didn't feel good, would anybody bother with it? And the human race would be extinct. Wouldn't have made it. There's your proof that God has a sense of humor. Wouldn't it just be easier if we could just divide every few months or years?
That's a great thought, yeah.
Now, why is it better to do it the other way, aside from the personal prejudice? That's how you get differentiation and change and development, is because instead of just dividing in half and having, 2 bills and 4 bills and 8 bills. What good is that? Who needs that? You'd be boring. What? Instead, you have recombinations of different things. Right? So,
well, you have to be social to do the other one, which is.
Well, the individual doesn't need it, but the species does.
Well,
that's why the individual wants it.
It could also be cognitive. But
well, that's the challenge here.
That's what I'm saying.
Remember what he said about some societies didn't even have the institution of marriage? What do you think it would be like if there was no institution of marriage? If you look at all civilizations, they all got some version of it, right? Even if one guy can have 10 wives. The civilizations that don't have that, they don't last too long. Probably because the guys kill each other. And there's a bunch of women, where are the guys? Oh, they're dead. Huh? Yeah. All right, so we can't just say that animal impulses are bad. But if they're not governed by reason, then you have a problem. And this is the ultimate question, right? Are you free if you're governed by impulses that violate your reason? Or are you free if you don't have enough reason to know that these impulses are a violation? some people do bad things because they just don't know better. That's obviously kind of abhorrent, isn't it? So, I mean, this is the problem that Schiller's pointing out here that you got to solve. If you really want to have human freedom, then you have to have the individual impulses of the individual in society. They have to be in harmony with reason. So how do you do that? If you think you know the answer, raise your hand.
What's the question? Next question again.
How do you create a society where people's impulses are in harmony with reason? How do you do it?
Put him in the basement.
Put them in the basement. That's a joke, right?
Yes.
Oh.
Sort of. No, it's a joke.
What's your solution?
The HBPA. Start with that. New redwoods, you know, get a new culture, higher level shake up, everybody get to Mars.
Higher level of culture.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think Schiller said? They didn't have this mortgage thing.
I'm sure he's got some economic programs in there somewhere.
Well, if you want somebody to learn physics, right, they study physics, right? They study the history of science, and they learn to think that way. They learn how the discoveries are made. So how do you educate emotions?
Create poets.
Do what?
Create a society of poets.
Well, that might work. Well, how does that solve the problem, though?
Well, if you're trying to create a society that doesn't do good because of fear of punishment, but do good because they can make I guess you say the right decisions because of reason, then with what you read earlier, this the conclusion of this idea of the poet, like having the freedom to to have access to heaven, and that's kind of to a certain degree like to have the idea or to have the I don't know. It was heading in the right direction.
Keep going.
Well, to have the access to tap into, I guess, the lawfulness of, this organization of reason. If you create poets, then based on that conclusion, that'd be a start. That'd be an interesting.
Well, that brings up the question: what does a poet do? Or let's say, this is not just poetry.
Yeah.
Well, let's back up a second. All right. The real issue is, can you get somebody's emotions in accord with reason? Is that possible?
Yes.
How do you know?
Well,
Who told you?
Schiller, and was one of them.
He said it's possible.
Yeah.
Well,
He said that you can eventually condition your spirit or console your soul, whatever you want to refer to it as. I don't know, like spirit, but to develop an appetite for these things, the way that you can develop an appetite for anything else. Like most people at least have the experience of have exposure to classical music before. I don't know, some people have had to study in school or whatever. But I'm pretty sure that if people reflect on it, their appetite for classical composition, for example, now is at least not what it was initially. Or at least there's more of an appreciation, or there's a different, it's different in whatever way it's different. And I think it works the same way with the soul. That that is the soul, but it's just that way. You just are constantly surrounding yourself with beauty, constantly surrounding yourself with culture, so that it becomes a part of your mental atmosphere in your mind always, and you desire that to a point where anything that's less than that is grotesque.
Does that sound like an answer?
I don't know.
I don't know if it's just surrounding yourself with it that can do it. I think there's something else. I have to, I don't know, certain, like, will, like a decision or will or something that you have to figure something out.
Well, why don't we ask this question? Let's go the opposite way. If you have people surrounded by ugliness, right, and irrationality, that's all they know. What is the effect of that? Or even, it's going to be pretty hard to develop into a rational being if you're surrounded by irrationality, right? Although we do know that even in those conditions, there's some rationality, and some people come out of it, right? That happens because, why? Because they're human. They're not bound by whatever condition that they find themselves in. Although, that's not the way you go about creating geniuses. You don't, just because some people can emerge from that victorious, you don't put everybody through that. You want to create people whose impulses are in harmony with reason, then you have to somehow train their emotions to be in harmony with reason. She's saying that I guess you read Schiller. That's what art does. Did anybody here ever heard that concept of art before they came to the LaRouche movement? That art was supposed to make you train your emotions?
No.
I hope that concept had existed before I knew it did.
You had hopes that somewhere somebody had that idea.
Yeah, because I went to art school and it's crazy.
You went to art school and it was crazy.
Yeah.
Because it said that art was what?
Just whatever.
Whatever you want it to
Yeah,
be.
whatever. You,
Expressing whatever crappy emotion that you felt at the time.
I mean,
Exactly.
quite
Shooting at a
literally
canvas.
crappy.
Art is a
Yeah.
manifestation of your emotions.
The art is expressing yourself.
If you feel constipated.
Is constipated emotion?
The funny thing is, I went to art school, and my
Yeah.
reaction was to want to go to study science.
Right?
Because
Art
there-
school convinced you that you had to study science.
Yeah, but then what I found out from studying science was that art comes from science.
Okay. So what is the subject of art?
Well, but aren't the emotions organized according to reason? Like if you say, for example, that they come from necessities and things like that, aren't those organized by reason, like by principles?
Well, necessity is governed by the lawfulness of the universe, whether you know what it is or not, right? So the question is, how do you get, is it possible? And if it is, how do you do it to get the emotions to be in accord with that?
Well, maybe you'd have to understand what that organization is.
Well, that seems to be a part of it, but is that all there is to it? Because you can know that something's right, but that doesn't mean you want to do it. And you can take that from, I know I shouldn't have this Twinkie, to I should jump in front of that truck and save that kid, even though I might get killed, right? Or I may have to go off to war to fight an enemy that's going to destroy my society. You may have to knowingly sacrifice your life to do what you know is right. Right? That's a big leap, right? But it's all a question of an emotion versus reason, or an emotion in accord with reason. All right, well, let's put it this way. If you wanted to create a society where everybody wants to be able to make a basket without thinking, what do? You have them all play basketball, or constantly shooting by basket. Right? You want to create a society of people who can kill on command other human beings efficiently. What do?
Have them hunt with Dick Cheney.
That's not logistically feasible. Well, one way you would do it is you'd give them games so that when they're in their leisure time, right, when they're exercising their capacities as a human being for the sake of those capacities and not for any other thing, that they're practicing homicide. And they're getting rewarded for it, right? Maybe they get rewarded with blinking lights or extra points or tokens, so you can do more of it. Who here has played video games? Come on, be honest. If you played a video game, I mean, who's really gotten into it so you did it for hours and hours? Okay. Why would you do that? What is the appeal of that?
Get better.
Or
Aren't you exercising a power when you do that?
You think
actually
you
can
are.
gain power depending on what game you're playing.
Well, you're doing something. There's a whole setup that makes you think that you're actually accomplishing something. Right? You're developing a skill to do something. And the image of that skill in a lot of these games is to kill something. To kill somebody, an alien or another human or a cop or whatever.
Kill the boss.
Yeah. Right? But you're getting psychologically rewarded for that. Right? And you keep doing it. And you feel a surge of pleasure. Right? It's pleasing to you that you can kill more people than the guy next to you. Faster and more efficiently. Right? Okay, now, is this good?
No.
All right. All right, well, what about pornography? What is that about? You want to tell us? Isn't that like the same thing? Is it like virtual reality?
Ew.
Ew, yes. Ew, I concur. What does it do?
I guess it becomes reality in certain
Yeah, all right, well, you basically, aren't you training? If you're constantly playing this video game and getting rewarded and experiencing pleasure, the better you get at simulating homicide, aren't you educating your emotions?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why they invented these things. They actually, it started when they tried to train soldiers who didn't want to shoot people to overcome their resistance to shooting people. That's why they invented these things. Right? And then someone said, hey, well, this is a lot of fun. Why don't we have kids do it? Or, certain other clever people say, this has lots of potential for what we're going to do to Iraq, etc. And it's the same thing. If you think of every bad thing that you ever do, things that you know are bad for you, right, or things that you didn't know were bad for you, but they are, you're basically training your emotions. You are training yourself to take pleasure in something that's bad for you.
I was just wondering, would you also consider YouTube?
YouTube?
Yeah.
Well, what do you think? Depends on what you're doing. I don't even hardly know what YouTube is. I know it's like you get like little TV clips or something, right?
Yeah, it's like a mini TV.
Yeah. Well, if you're using it to spread reason, great. But how often does that happen?
They've got tons of opera clips on there.
Tons of what?
Opera.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay, fine. But what are most people doing with it?
playing with their belly button.
That's abhorrent. What are you doing on MySpace? You have a fantasy that there's hundreds of people out there that like you. Isn't that what it is?
Yeah.
Why would you sit there, exchanging messages with somebody? If they really liked you, wouldn't you get together?
I don't suggest that. You might end up dead.
It's not reality. All right, but you're training your emotions. Right? Anything that you do over and over and over again, and take enjoyment from, you're training your emotions a certain way. Right? I can't really think that you could actually, I guess if you have to be a soldier and you have to be able to shoot people, then it might be useful to have a video game. But we saw what happened with the cops. Obviously, they had some kind of training that said, okay, black man reaches for wallet, unload gun. And it was automatic. Because you would hope that they would think about it a second, right? And it happens a little bit too often. All right, the point I'm making is that in the same way that we have all these examples of unesthetic education, education of the emotion to do evil and, indulge in disgusting things. Well, there's an opposite side to it. There's a positive side. Is that you can train the emotions to take pleasure in reason. Take pleasure in what's good and decent. Right? Does that make sense? Well, that's what Schiller's thesis is. That's what Ardina was talking about. She's, from the advanced class, so. The thing about this is you actually, obviously we don't have time. Huh?
No.
What'd you say?
No.
Yeah, what'd you say, Aaron?
Passing notes in class? Well, all right, let's look at this emotion thing one more time. See, this emotion, this desire, okay, this is why people do things, because they want to do them. They have impulses, right? And as opposed to, remember the impulse of knowledge, or formal impulses is to discover the one out of many. Well, what Schiller calls the life impulse, which is also the sensuous impulse, is you seek change. You don't want to experience the same thing constantly. You want things to change, right? But where's the change that is in correspondence with reason? Where is that? Now, you might want to check out the Philebus dialogue, because he has a whole analysis of pleasure and pain there, Plato. He basically says physical pleasure is when you satisfy a need, an imbalance, right? If you feel thirst, you experience pleasure when you drink water or wine or whatever the hell, right? Because you're satisfying something that's not there. Or if you eat when you're hungry, right? And it's good that happens, but you can go overboard. And something that's good can become the opposite. Whereas there's other kinds of pleasures that are experienced, like he talks about the pleasures of the mind, like the experience of knowledge or harmony or beauty, which the more you experience them, the better. I imagine you could listen to too much Beethoven if that's all you did, as opposed to doing other things, right? You could definitely eat too many hot dogs. That's for sure. Maybe one or two would be satisfy hunger, but after that, what are you doing? Right? Whereas with 2 hours of Beethoven and 3 hours of Schiller and 6 hours of Kepler, 8 hours of organizing, you'd be pretty tired, but those are good things, right? And you can experience pleasure in that. But I mean, you're not going to necessarily do that like right off the bat. But it's kind of something that you train yourself to. And as you might think, it's a good idea to start young. I mean, there's a lot of different references in, philosophy and history that, about how do you train young people, and it goes through that kind of thing.
I have a question, and I have a very dear friend of mine who, in a recent discussion we had, because we were talking about the initial phases of beginning to train the emotions. Now, could you say something about acting against what you feel like doing, the uncultivated emotions, and how that's different from not being honest because you're at least expressing the way you actually honestly feel, as opposed to, maybe that. Do you see what I'm saying? We were arguing with the difference between
faking it as opposed to really wanting to.
Yeah, the difference between like saying, well, that's not the way I really feel though. I mean, I'm expressing the way I really feel, and that's me being honest, and then when you say, okay, well, that's not reasonable for me to act that out because that's not the most reasonable way to behave. Just the difference. Why is it not kind of bondage to act against the way you feel like acting?
Well, you're not necessarily going to be free, like that. Because you're not free if you're under compulsion, right? Now, given a choice between having the animal impulse rule over reason or having reason rule over the impulse, what's the rational choice?
Reason.
If you choose reason, you can solve that problem. If you choose the animal impulse, you're not going to solve it. Right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if you rationally want to be able to run a mile in 6 minutes, you're not going to solve that problem by, going out and running when you feel like it. You sort of have to do it every day or every other day or some kind of regular schedule. In fact, I want to read you something on this question of training. All right. I mean, does that answer your question? I mean, I don't think it gets. You have to ask yourself what you want, right? And if you want something that's irrational, then you got to use your reason and work it through. Because, at some level, I mean, it's kind of weird, but you got to really think about it. At some level, you don't ever do anything that you don't want to do, or vice versa. If you really don't want to learn Kepler, ain't nobody going to force you to learn it. Nobody's going to make you study it. Nobody can put an idea in your head. You have to want to figure it out. I mean, that's why it's good to start early educating kids, because they want to do everything, right? And they have a real vested interest in finding out what all those noises coming out of people's mouths are. That's why they learn. I mean, you think about it. Like, if I told you you have to learn Chinese in the next 2 years, what are you going to think? Oh my God.
No.
Huh?
It's pretty interesting.
Huh? Well, think about it. There's thousands, there's millions of Chinese kids going to learn Chinese in the next 2 years, right? Better than you will ever speak it. And they're kids. They don't know nothing. They don't know who LaRouche is. They study nothing. They don't know grammar. All right. Well, let's say five years from now, they're going to walk up to you and they're going to know Chinese better than you ever know it, even if you work real hard. Well, maybe not. Why? Because they really want to. So, I mean, if you don't want to master these things and don't want to, create beauty through art, don't want to get the, HBPA passed, it ain't going to happen. I mean, I'm not saying that it's bad to have this conflict, because, I mean, it's better for the reason to win out. But that's not the condition of mankind that Schiller is saying is the best. You get what I'm saying? But I mean, in the ideal, you know that that's the best. Any problems with that before I start reading this thing? Okay. All right, it's getting late. I know you guys have important work to do. I can't find this. All right. This is from Shelley, he wrote a defense of poetry.
Hey, Bill, real quick.
One day you're going to get a Shelley class from somebody. I don't know who.
Real quick. Have we changed our definition yet of what emotion is? Because it seems like we've been generally discussing it as a bestial impulse, which I don't agree with.
Well, I never said that.
Okay.
I mean, what do you want to call emotion? That which causes you to act. That which causes you to do something rather than something else. Or what you want to do.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, because, the soul has, it strives for change. It strives for different perceptions, like it's Leibniz put it. The question is, what governs that? Right? And you brought up the question of appetites, right? Leibniz, in the monadology, he calls this process of striving for new perceptions appetition. Right? Like, the monad is the soul, like of a body. The soul will have perceptions, of relationships of, representations of what's not the soul in the soul. Like the representation in the soul of what's going on in the body when the body is thirsty. Right? And that representation of that perception, the appetition of the soul is, I need something to drink. Right? So it strives toward the perception of non-thirst, drinking something. Does that make sense? This is the motion that occurs. Right? But the principle of the appetition, that depends on the condition of the soul. Right? Or other things. Like you might be in the middle of a fascinating lecture on aesthetics, such that despite your tremendous thirst, you sit there rapt with attention to what the guy in the blue shirt says. Right? Huh? So you have this impulse to, if it were something else going on, you'd run off and get the water, but you want to master these ideas, so you're stuck, literally can't move from the chair. Because there's a higher reason ruling, okay? Of course, Aaron didn't have that problem. Give you other examples. All right, so that's what I'd say about emotion. What's going on in your soul? It's impelling you to move towards something. I think that's why it has the word motion in it. Does that make sense? Or you can be stupid and say, that's what I want to do. What I want. Or you can say, it's how I feel about what's happening. But, this is important to get straight. Because everything that happens to you, everything that you experience, everything that you do, you have some kind of emotional relationship to it. Ultimately, even if you don't think so. Mm-hmm. Even if it's algebra. And I don't mean you hate algebra. Even if you're a master of algebra, that you have some invested idea of algebra. You supposedly mastered it and you think it really works. You think that's how the universe works. Now, if you can employ it as a tool, that's one thing. But you may think that's how things actually work, and that's a problem. That's why you can experience this tension when you're actually in the process of discovering. You're going to feel that because at some level, you're figuring out that what you were thinking before was totally wrong. Right? Now, I would imagine that after a while, you start to enjoy that. Although for some people, that's really painful. Does that sound right? Does that make sense? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, if you worked on something for hours or days and days, and then you finally realize, and you, oh man, that's so obvious. You ever had that experience? I know Lynn says that, you know, that's the hallmark of an intelligent person is when they enjoy that, as opposed to saying, God damn it. You know, they enjoy the feeling of discovering that they've been an idiot. Of course. Okay. I was reading over this piece, Defense of Poetry by Shelley. This is one of those English poets I said that the English like to kill because they're good. Even worse than the Germans. And he's answering this. Somebody made a proposal that poetry is immoral because it doesn't necessarily instruct one to do good. And what do you think of that idea? If I write a poem and I don't tell you, well, you have to do this and not do that, does that mean the poem is bad?
Did you read that thing? Did you read that thing?
Did I?
Yeah.
Did I just read this?
No, the 4 ages of poetry.
No.
You didn't?
No.
Okay.
You gonna recite it for us?
No, it's what he's. I'll talk to you later. it's what he's responding to.
Mm-hmm.
4 ages of poetry.
Oh, yeah.
If you read it.
All right. The whole objection, however, of the immorality of poetry rests upon a misconception of the manner in which poetry acts to produce the moral improvement of man. Ethical science arranges the elements which poetry has created and propounds schemes and proposes examples of civil and domestic life. Nor is it for want of admirable doctrines that men hate and despise and censure and deceive and subjugate one another. But poetry acts in another and diviner manner. It awakens and enlarges the mind itself by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. It reproduces all that it represents, and the impersonations clothed in its Elysian light stand thenceforth in the minds of those who have once contemplated them as memorials of that gentle and exalted content which extends itself over all thoughts and actions with which it coexists. The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our nature, and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful, which exists in thought, action, or person, not our own. A man, to be greatly good, must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasure of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. Poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with thoughts of ever new delight, which have the power of attracting and assimilating to their own nature all other thoughts, and which form new intervals and interstices whose void forever craves fresh food. Poetry strengthens the faculty, which is the organ of the moral nature of man, in the same manner as exercise strengthens a limb. Let's stop there.
What's ecstasy? What's the word?
Interstices?
Interstices, yeah.
You know, in between.
Interstices.
Yeah.
Interspersed. See.
See, this metaphor of exercise keeps popping up. It's kind of funny, isn't it? Aesthetical education.
memberships?
Nothing here.
Well, they used to have the gymnasium in Germany. That's where the word comes from. Now look, there's a lot more obviously to say on this. Obviously, also, we just skimmed the surface of these letters here. You can't really, you have to work through it. It's like 27 letters of intense reasoning. It's like reading the monadology 4 times, okay?
Do we have any more of the first book? Because I can't find anything. See a bunch of the
Well, most of the stuff in here I think is on the internet, but we can solve that problem. I always hear about better translations than the one in here, but I think it's pretty good. I'm going to get onto that question. Let me finish, though. Hopefully it got you interested in investigating this question of aesthetical education and educating the emotions. Now, I just want to refer to a couple of things here and then close out. Oh yeah, I have to give you some inspiration, right? You want some inspiration, don't you?
Yeah.
Yes, please. All right, remember, when Schiller started out as a professor of universal history, he gave this lecture. And it was called, What is and to what end do we study universal history? Okay. So he's addressed to you students of history. All preceding ages, without knowing it or aiming at it, have striven to bring about our human century. Ours are all the treasures which diligence and genius, reason and experience, have finally brought home in the long age of the world. Only from history will you learn to set a value on the goods from which habit and unchallenged possession so easily deprive our gratitude. Priceless, precious goods upon which the blood of the best and the most noble clings. Goods which had to be won by the hard work of so many generations. And who among you, in whom a bright spirit is conjugated with a feeling heart, could bear this high obligation in mind without a silent wish being aroused in him to pay that debt to coming generations which he can no longer discharge to those past? A noble desire must glow in us to also make a contribution out of our means to this rich bequest of truth, morality, and freedom which we received from the world past, and which we must surrender once more, richly enlarged, to the world to come, and in this eternal chain which winds itself through all human generations, to make firm our ephemeral existence. However different the destinies may be which await you in society, all of you can contribute something to this. A path toward immortality has been opened up to every achievement, to the true immortality, I mean, where the deed lives and rushes onward, even if the name of the author should remain behind. That whole speech is like an organizing discussion. Okay. Anybody here remember the speech Helga gave August 2003 conference?
Yeah, I remember doing it.
It's pretty intense. Let's see. I think that's one of the ones where very few people got to go to the conference. She gave a speech called Overcoming Your Fears by Increasing Your Geistesmasse. How many of you didn't know you had Geistesmasse? Good question. I can't go through the whole speech, but I know there's some interesting things here in terms of the relationship between Schiller and LaRouche, at least from my standpoint, and then of course there's Helga, who's been working on this for decades. one of the people that was in that audience for Schiller's speech was this guy, Herbart. I think it's Johann Friedrich Herbart. And he later became known as like the founder of the science of pedagogy. You ever heard of that? Anyway. And I don't remember the source, but it's apparently he was inspired. He was so inspired by the letters on aesthetical education that he decided to focus on philosophy. Now, I can't get into a whole lot of detail. Obviously, we gotta move along here. I'm going to be done in about 5 minutes, but just something to look at. You should look at this speech here, because Herbart was a great influence on Bernhard Riemann. If you read what Herbart wrote, this piece, which was about the application. Let me read the title. What was it called? Yeah, on the possibility and the necessity of applying mathematics to psychology. Okay, that's not statistics, how many men like to wear dresses per capita, that kind of nonsense that they call mathematics. So this is actually applied to the science of the human mind. And he says, so far, mathematics has only been applied to objects, to lengths, to measurement, and so forth. But how can one measure the mental processes? Perceptions, feelings, desires are changing rapidly. And how can one measure them? How can one determine their magnitude? Are you over there? Thought, an idea passing through the mind, is faster than the lightning and the storm. Moods are changing quicker than the wind and the weather. How is it possible to find a mathematical lawfulness for thought? And then he asks the question, is it true that if we can't measure, we can't calculate? Therefore, we can't use mathematics or psychology? And he says, no, that's not true. You don't have to measure before you can calculate. And then he attacks Newton in his paper. He says, the assertion that you can only perform calculations after you have first made measurements is completely false. Quite the contrary. You can make calculations on the basis of any hypothetically assumed relationship of magnitudes. Indeed, even of a demonstrably false one. And when we are considering deeply hidden but nonetheless important issues, we are obliged to experiment in hypotheses as long as necessary, and to use calculation to investigate the consequences flowing therefrom as accurately as is necessary. As accurately as is necessary for us to determine which of the various hypotheses coincide with our experience. Thus, the ancient astronomers experimented with eccentric circles, and Kepler experimented with the ellipse, in order to trace back the origin of the planet's movements. And he compared the squares of the orbital periods with the cubes of the mean distances from the sun, before he found that they were in agreement. Okay. Then he says, it's pretty funny. The word planet indicates something wayward or veering off course, or if you will, with reference to the phantasms of astrology, an errant knight who romantically goes out on fearsome or amorous adventures. The errant knights have all vanished like ghosts now, and since then, ignorance has been supplanted by science. Now the planets all behave according to what the calendar says. and that's very naturally the case, since it is the calendars which have learned to behave according to what the planets say. And precisely so, and in this very same sense, genius would now behave according to what psychology says, if only our psychology were based on as much true science as our calendars are. Thank you. Let so much be said about genius, which indeed has no knowledge of the rules of its own behavior, but which nevertheless cannot deny that it has such, since after all, non-knowledge is no proof of non-existence. All right. Then he says, let's see. All right. That's enough quotes there. But she has a discussion here about the relationships of ideas to one another and how you can measure, how you could measure the processes of minds in terms of the strength of thought, the degree of delimitation of ideas, the degree of internal connection to other thoughts, the aggregate of connected thoughts, the length of sequences of thoughts, susceptibility to stimulation at various points, greater or lesser degree of involution or evolution, the meshing or isolation, and the speed or slowness of change under varying conditions. In other words, he's talking about an idea of the conception of the ideas in the mind as a manifold, developing multiply connected manifold. All right, so you see where this where Riemann comes from out of this. Well, I can't really elaborate on that, but this is very interesting. It is not only possible, but necessary to apply mathematics to psychology. To put it in a nutshell, the reason for this necessity lies in the fact that otherwise we will simply never attain what all speculation ultimately seeks, and that is certainty. And the necessity is that we finally embark upon the path to solid certainty is all the more urgent, the greater the danger becomes each day. That philosophy in Germany will soon descend into the same condition it has been in for quite some time now in France and England. How you like that? And then Helga says, which is the world of empiricism and positivism. And he says that it is the stupidity of most philosophers that they don't see this dangers. If they understand what mathematics is and that it's more than just some formulas, they would know that undefined talk, where everybody has their own interpretation of notions, can only lead to a daily growing division of opinion. And this is the reason why only mathematics can give certainty, because in mathematics you have proof, in which you arrive at the same result in different ways. All right. All right, now let's just leap on over to Helga talking about Riemann, because this is like Riemann is a student of this guy. I mean, he is this Riemann. Let's see, '96 we published in 21st Century some translations of Riemann's work, including concerning psychology and metaphysics, and then there's some commentary on some antinomies of Herbart. Just to give you some idea of this. Okay, now I'll just tell you, you read Schiller, or well, if you read, for me, reading Leibniz and reading Schiller is almost the same thing. Although Schiller is much more, his metaphors are richer, I guess. Because he's constantly challenging you to define things in a certain way. But not just, here you have to accept my definition. You have to figure out, if you say truth or beauty or freedom, what are you talking about? Because we all have a general notion of freedom, right? But what is freedom really? And he goes through, it's not just doing whatever the hell you feel like it. Although it is. But if you just do whatever the hell you feel like, are you free? Well, depends. But it's just like constantly forcing you, like in Plato, to go through a dialogue on what do these concepts mean. Now, if you think about the breakthrough that Riemann makes in science, where he basically throws Euclid completely in the garbage forever by saying that there's no such thing as, self-evident mathematics. All there is mathematical reasoning applied to the organization of space and time, which is derived through our experience. In other words, there's no a priori geometry to the way the universe works. You have to discover what it is. And all of that is dependent on your ideas of magnitude. The discovery of your concept of magnitude in space, which are relatively efficient or not. So that the process of discovery in science is like constantly creating new conceptions which give you a more powerful conception of how space is organized. All right, that's kind of a description. All right, but I hope a lot of you work through that. And if you haven't, you will soon. Now, in this paper of Riemann, it's called Concerning Psychology and Metaphysics, he starts off by saying he's a Herbartian, that he's a follower of Herbart. And this is, all right, some of this is direct from Riemann and some of this is Helga. Quote, with each act of thinking, something persists and substantial enters our soul. I call it Geistesmasse, thought mass. Geist means spirit or mind, and mass means mass, or Lynn likes to use the term thought object. All thinking, therefore, is building of new Geistesmassen, new thought masses. These Geistesmassen appear as conceptions. Because of their different inner conditions, they appear as different qualities. They connect, melt together, complicate each other, interact partially among each other, and partially they mix with older Geistesmassen. The kind and power of these conceptions were recognized by Herbart, Riemann says, only in part. And I will complete this idea now. The soul is a compact of manifoldly connected Geistesmassen. It grows continuously through new thought masses. The Geistesmassen are imperishable, everlasting. Only the relative power of these connections changes through the addition of new Geistesmassen. The Geistesmassen do not need a material carrier and don't have a continuous effect in the world of appearances. They don't have a relation to any part of matter and are therefore not located in space. But any new emergence and all connecting of Geistesmassen need a material carrier. So only the new ones need a carrier. All thinking, therefore, occurs in a specific place. Each new Geistesmasse resonates with all related Geistesmassen, and the stronger, the less the difference of their quality is. All right. Now that's all Riemann. Now this is Helga. Now you've all met your typical average nice guy American or nice American girl who is blocked. They're nice but blocked. And because they refuse to discuss intellectual issues because nothing resonates. And because nothing resonates, they're afraid to discuss issues which they feel they don't know anything about. So I think this is a very important idea, that the reason why people seem to be so moronized and blocked, that's a new word, is because there's nothing there. No Geistesmassen there. So nothing can resonate. But this is, here we go again. But this is very important because you have to have a plan in your life where you add Geistesmassen in all fields. You have to build your mind. You have to build your brain cells as if you would in a gym. You work on this machine. You work on history. You work on natural science. You work on philosophy. So people should take their mind and the building of their Geistesmassen as seriously as they take the sports process. Okay. Now, Riemann continues and says, the interaction of two simultaneously forming Geistesmassen. Now this all sounds very abstract. But if you do this in practice, you realize that once you study history, and once you study philosophy, once you start music, these things tell you laws which you can apply in each field. It's not that these things are completely different, but that once you understand certain lawfulnesses in one area of knowledge, you find out that it does connect in principled ways to others, and they do interact. Now, all forming new Geistesmassen interact directly with previously built Geistesmassen, and indirectly with the others. The weaker, the further they are away, and the less they are connected. The most simple expression of the efficiency of the older Geistesmaßen is their reproduction, which consists in the effect to produce a similar one. All right. Now, let's skip a little bit ahead. So, I should read this. This is Helga again. Let's apply these laws of mental development, which we concluded from our own inner perception, to explain the expediency we find on earth for the explanation of our existence and historical development. Riemann says, for the explanation of the life of our soul, we must assume that the Geistesmaßen created in our nerve processes continue to exist as part of our soul, that their interconnection remains, and that they only change insofar as we add new Geistesmaßen. An immediate consequence of this is that the souls of organic beings, that is, Geistesmaßen which come into being during the lifetime, continue to exist after death. Now, because of what we produce in terms of our ideas, of series of conceptions, of knowledge, this constitutes the immortality of the soul. Now, this is the same idea which Nicolaus von Kues had in the 15th century, where he said, the soul is the place where the sciences are created. So much so that these would not exist without the former. And since the sciences, once they are created, are immortal, so is the soul which created them. So the laws of the macrocosm and microcosm follow the same principle, which is why the immaterial idea can have an effect in the physical universe. This is the same idea as Leibniz's monads. And this idea of the growth of the Geistesmaßen, of ideas which have been generated, which do not die with the person ending their mortal life, that these Geistesmaßen continue to increase even if the people die. That's the same idea as Vernadsky's, who said that eventually the noosphere is completely dominating the biosphere. That the cognitive principle in evolution will become stronger and stronger and eventually be completely dominant. And that is when the infantilism of mankind will stop. Now, if what Schiller says is true, namely that you can educate your emotions on the same level as your mind, as your cognitive side, and I absolutely insist that that is true, then one can educate the emotional faculties in the same way as reason. What Herbart and Riemann say about Geistesmaßen should then also apply to the emotional faculties. If one remembers what Riemann said, and I'm just replacing his mental act with emotional act, with each emotional act, something remaining and substantial enters our soul. I call it emotional differentiations. They appear as different qualities. They connect, melt together, complicate each other, partially among each other, partially with older emotions. The soul, therefore, is a compact manifold of connected Geistesmaßen and emotional differentiations. Each new emotional experience or act resonates with all related emotional experiences, and the stronger, the less the difference of their quality is. Now in psychology, one calls this normally cathexis, an emotional memory, that if people have had a certain emotional experience and they come into a similar situation, they have a cathexis, which brings forward emotions which they thought were long forgotten, but they react apparently in a similar way. But Schiller says they don't have to do that in a mechanistic way on the same level. We are not in a situation where the mind accumulates more complex Geistesmaßen and the emotional faculties remain fixed. Man becomes more smart, that man becomes more smart, scientifically educated, but still remains the same brute who goes home and beats his wife. That does not have to be the case. They become more differentiated, more beautiful, and more powerful too. In a harmonious person, They are of one quality, with the increasing of knowledge and Geistesmaßen as such. So what we have to do is work to give the stunted plant of people today who are emotionally crippled, because the biggest problem is not with their thinking. The biggest problem is with their feeling, that they cannot feel in a human way. What we have to do is to give these stunted plants, these poor, crippled human beings, what every gardener would do: some water, some fertilizer to make them grow. All right, I'm going to stop there. I wonder if that's why they call the secondary schools in Schiller's time the gymnasium. There's got to be some relationship there. Okay, so you can educate your emotions, so you can make yourself better. I mean, how much is it, like in the baby boomer culture and everything else out there, that says you can't change or that you shouldn't change? That's kind of stupid, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go out there and change.